Sometimes life gives us exactly what we need when we least expect it. For 66-year-old Daniel Reyes, that moment came on a grey morning when grief had worn his faith thin as paper. Walking the shore of his small coastal village, Daniel spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. There in the shallow water stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, her hands folded in prayer, seaweed wrapped around her feet. She hadn't washed up from a storm or fallen from a boat. She was simply there, waiting. Daniel had walked away from God years ago after losing his daughter, but something about this statue called to him. He carried her home and placed her in his shed, not knowing that this simple act would change everything. What happened next would restore his faith in ways he never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt air carried the scent of morning as Daniel Reyes pulled his weathered fishing net from the shallow waters, checking each knot with the practiced eye of a man who had mended more than just rope in his 66 years. The net was old, patched in dozens of places with different colored twine, a map of seasons and storms, of careful repairs made by lamplight in his small kitchen. Each patch told a story, each mend a testament to his methodical nature, his refusal to waste what could still serve. The village of San Miguel del Mar clung to the rocky coastline like barnacles to a ship's hull, its whitewashed houses climbing the hillside in terraced rows. Fishing boats bobbed in the protected harbor, their bright blues and yellows faded by sun and spray. This had been Daniel's world for more than 4 decades, a place where time moved with the tides, and everyone knew everyone else's sorrows as intimately as their own. But Daniel had pulled away from that intimacy 3 years ago, the morning after they buried his daughter Maria. She had been 28, a teacher at the village school with her mother's gentle laugh and her father's stubborn determination. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday evening as she drove home from parent conferences. A drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection near the church. Daniel had been mending nets in his shed when Father Miguel knocked on his door, the priest's face pale in the porch light. "Daniel, my son," the old priest had said, his voice breaking, "there's been an accident." Maria's funeral had filled the little church of San Miguel. Students, parents, teachers, fishermen, half the village came to say goodbye to the young woman who had taught their children to read and dream. Daniel sat in the front pew beside his wife Elena, feeling as if he were watching the service through thick glass. The prayers, the hymns, the words of comfort, none of it reached him. God had taken his only child, his bright, beautiful daughter, who had never harmed a soul. Elena tried to bridge the gap that opened between them and their faith. She continued attending Mass, continued lighting candles for Maria, continued believing that God had a plan, even when that plan made no earthly sense. "She's with the angels now," Elena would whisper in the dark, her voice thick with tears. "She's at peace, Daniel. We have to believe that." But Daniel couldn't believe it. He couldn't accept that a loving God would allow a drunk driver to snuff out a life so full of promise. He stopped going to church, stopped saying grace before meals, stopped finding comfort in the rituals that had sustained him since childhood. When Elena died 2 years later, her heart simply giving out from grief, the doctor said Daniel's last thread of connection to the divine snapped completely. The morning routine had become his anchor in those dark months. Rise before dawn, walk the shore, check his small boat, mend what needed mending. He spoke to few people beyond the necessary exchanges at the market or harbor. Rosa Martinez, his neighbor of 30 years, still brought him dinner twice a week, despite his protests. Father Miguel still stopped by monthly, though Daniel never invited him inside. "You're wasting away, Daniel," Rosa had told him just last week, setting a pot of fish stew on his kitchen table. "Elena wouldn't want this for you." Rosa was 72, a widow herself who had raised 5 children after her husband died in a fishing accident. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they still moved with purpose as she bustled around his kitchen, washing dishes he had left in the sink, straightening newspapers he had abandoned half-read. "Elena is gone," Daniel had replied, his voice flat. What Elena would want doesn't matter anymore. But Rosa had only clicked her tongue and continued cleaning, the way she had done for decades whenever someone in the village needed tending. She understood grief, understood the way it could hollow a person out until they were just going through the motions of living. The house felt too big without Elena's humming in the kitchen, without Maria's weekend visits that filled the rooms with laughter and the scent of her perfume. Daniel had moved into the spare bedroom, unable to sleep in the bed he had shared with his wife for 38 years. Maria's room remained exactly as she had left it, textbooks stacked on the desk, a half-finished scarf she had been knitting, for him draped over the chair. In the shed behind the house, among his nets and tackle boxes, Daniel had hidden the reminders of his former faith. A wooden crucifix Elena had given him on their wedding day lay wrapped in an old towel, Maria's first communion rosary, tiny pearl beads on a silver chain, sat in a tobacco tin alongside medals of various saints. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away, but he couldn't bear to look at them either. Old Joaquin Herrera, the most experienced fisherman in the village, often worked alongside Daniel in the pre-dawn hours. At 81, Joaquin's weathered hands still guided his nets with the wisdom of 6 decades at sea. Unlike Rosa, he didn't offer advice or try to draw Daniel into conversation. They worked in comfortable silence, two men who understood that sometimes the ocean was the only company a person needed. "The sea doesn't lie to you," Joaquin had said once, unprompted as they pulled in their nets. "It's cruel or kind, but it's honest about both." Daniel had nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. The sea didn't promise fairness or reward good behavior. It simply was, vast, indifferent, eternal. In those days after losing Maria and Elena, that honesty felt like the only truth Daniel could trust. The village had tried to embrace him in its collective arms, the way small communities do when tragedy strikes one of their own. But Daniel had resisted, politely declining dinner invitations, avoiding the plaza where people gathered after evening mass, taking his boat out at times when the harbor would be mostly empty. He knew people talked. In a place like San Miguel del Mar, a man's grief became public property, discussed over coffee and debated in the market. Some said he was angry at God. Others claimed he had lost his mind. A few whispered that he blamed himself for not being able to protect his family. All of them were probably right. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of their theories. Daniel had loved God once, had believed in divine providence and the communion of saints and the promise of eternal life. He had raised Maria in that faith, had walked her to church every Sunday, had taught her to pray the rosary at Elena's side. When Maria died, it felt like God had betrayed not just him, but everything good and innocent in the world. Now, 3 years later, Daniel existed in a careful balance between routine and emptiness. He fished because he had always fished. He ate because his body required fuel. He slept because exhaustion eventually claimed him. But he no longer prayed, no longer hoped, no longer looked for meaning beyond the simple mechanics of survival. The morning he found the statue had started like any other. The August sky hung low and grey, promising rain before noon. Daniel had walked his usual route along the rocky shore, checking for driftwood or interesting shells, habits left over from the days when he would bring small treasures home to Elena. The tide was receding, leaving tidal pools jeweled with sea anemones and tiny crabs. That's when he saw her. The Virgin Mary stood waist-deep in the shallow water, her ceramic hands folded in eternal prayer, her painted face serene, despite the seaweed draped around her base like a garland. She was perhaps 18 inches tall, carved from dark wood and painted in traditional blues and whites. The gold details on her robes dulled, but still visible. Daniel stood frozen for several minutes, staring at the impossible sight. There had been no storm to wash her ashore, no boat in distress that might have lost cargo. She stood upright in the sand as if someone had carefully placed her there, waiting for this exact moment, for him to find her. His first instinct was to walk away, to pretend he had never seen her. But something in the statue's peaceful expression held him. Despite himself, despite 3 years of anger and rejection, Daniel found himself wading into the water. The statue was heavier than he expected, solid wood rather than hollow ceramic. As he lifted her from the water, something glinted at her base, a rosary wrapped around the carved folds of her robes. His breath caught the delicate silver chain, the tiny pearl beads. The way the light caught the metal, it looked exactly like Maria's first communion rosary, the one he had hidden away in his shed, but that was impossible. He had seen that rosary just months ago when he was looking for fishing line. It was still in the tobacco tin, still wrapped in tissue paper. This had to be a different one, similar but not the same. Still, his hands shook as he carried the statue up the beach toward home. The weight of her somehow both physical and spiritual, a burden he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. Daniel's hands trembled as he set the statue on the wooden workbench in his shed, the same bench where he had mended countless nets and repaired fishing gear for 40 years. The Virgin Mary's painted eyes seemed to follow him as he stepped back, her expression of infinite compassion, both comforting and unsettling. The rosary caught the afternoon light streaming through the shed's single window. Each pearl bead gleamed with an opalescent sheen that Daniel remembered all too well. He had held that rosary in his hands the day Father Miguel blessed it for Maria's first communion. He had watched his 7-year-old daughter practice her prayers. With it, her small fingers fumbling over the familiar sequence of Hail Marys and Our Fathers. With mounting dread, Daniel walked to the corner of the shed where he kept his toolbox. Beneath old rags and spare parts sat a rusted tobacco tin. His fingers felt numb as he pried off the lid, already knowing what he would find. The tin was empty. Daniel stared into the metal container where Maria's rosary had rested for 3 years, wrapped carefully in tissue paper alongside the medals and blessed palm fronds Elena had saved. Everything else remained, the small bronze medal of St. Christopher that Maria had worn on her school bag, the dried palm branch from their last Easter together, even the tissue paper, still folded, exactly as he had left it, but the rosary was gone. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice hoarse in the dusty silence of the shed. Daniel examined the rosary wound around the statue's base with the careful attention he usually reserved for checking his nets. The silver chain showed the exact pattern of tarnish he remembered, darker near the clasp where Maria's oils had touched it most often. The tiny crucifix bore the same small nick on the corpus that had appeared when 8-year-old Maria had accidentally dropped it on their kitchen's tile floor. Most damning of all was the inscription on the back of the centerpiece medal: Maria, Elena Reyes, Primera Comunión, 1995. The letters were so small they required squinting to read, but Daniel had memorized them long ago. This was Maria's rosary, not one that looked like it, not a similar design. This was the exact same rosary he had buried with his daughter 3 years ago. Daniel sank onto his workstool, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He had watched the undertaker place that rosary in Maria's hands during the final viewing. He had kissed her forehead goodbye and seen the silver chain resting against her white dress. The casket had been sealed, lowered into the ground, and covered with earth while he and Elena threw roses onto the polished wood. Yet here it was, wrapped around a statue he had pulled from the sea. The rational part of his mind searched desperately for explanations. Perhaps the funeral home had kept a duplicate for some reason. Perhaps there had been a mistake, a mix-up. Perhaps his grief-clouded memory was playing tricks on him, making him see connections that weren't really there. But even as he grasped for logical answers, something deeper in his chest was stirring. Not quite hope, not quite fear, but something he hadn't felt since the morning Father Miguel had knocked on his door with news of the accident. The shed door creaked open, and Rosa Martinez peered inside, her grey hair escaping from its customary bun. "Daniel, I saw you come back from your walk. Is everything—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she took in the statue on the workbench. "Dios mío," she breathed, crossing herself automatically. "Where did you find her?" "On the beach," Daniel replied, his voice barely above. A whisper. "She was just standing in the water." Rosa approached the statue with the reverence she usually reserved for the altar at Sunday Mass. Her arthritic fingers hovered over the Virgin's serene face without quite touching, as if she feared disturbing something sacred. "She's beautiful," Rosa murmured. "Look at the detail in the carving. This is old work made by someone who understood what they were creating." She paused, noticing the rosary. "And this, it belonged to Maria," Daniel said, the words scraping his throat raw. Rosa's eyes snapped to his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is Maria's first communion rosary, the one we buried with her." Daniel gestured helplessly at the tobacco tin. "It was in there until today. Now it's here, wrapped around this statue I found in the water." Rosa stared at him for a long moment, her weathered face cycling through disbelief, concern, and something approaching wonder. She had known the Reyes family for 30 years. She had attended Maria's first communion, had helped Elena prepare the celebration dinner afterward. She would remember the rosary, too. "Show me," she said quietly. Daniel lifted the rosary carefully from the statue's base and placed it in Rosa's palm. She held it up to the light, examining the inscription with the same methodical care he had used. Her breath caught as she read Maria's name and the date. "This is impossible, Daniel." "I know. The funeral home wouldn't have—" "I know." Rosa set the rosary gently on the workbench and sank into the old wooden chair Daniel kept for visitors, though he'd had precious few visitors in the past 3 years. They sat in silence for several minutes, both staring at the statue as if expecting her to offer some explanation for the inexplicable. Finally, Rosa spoke. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "I should probably return her to the church. This statue, she must belong to someone. Maybe she fell off a boat, or someone lost her during a move. With Maria's rosary wrapped around her base." Daniel had no answer for that. The afternoon light was fading when Rosa finally left, promising to return the next day with dinner and a clear head for thinking. Daniel remained in the shed as darkness gathered around the small building, the statue's pale face seeming to glow in the dimness. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel found himself speaking aloud to something other than Rosa or the occasional grocery clerk. "I don't understand what you want from me," he said to the statue. "If this is some kind of sign, I'm not ready for it. I'm not ready to believe again." The Virgin Mary's painted expression remained serene, unchanging. But as Daniel sat in the gathering darkness, something shifted in the quality of the silence. Around him, the usual weight of grief that pressed on his chest like a physical burden seemed to ease slightly, just enough for him to take a deep breath without the familiar ache of loss. He thought of Maria at 7 years old, carefully counting the beads of her new rosary while Eleanor guided her through the prayers. He remembered the concentration on her small face, the way she would close her eyes tightly during the Our Father, as if the darkness helped her focus on the words. "Papa," she had asked one evening after prayers, "do you think the Virgin Mary ever gets lonely in heaven?" Elena had smiled and touched their daughter's hair. "I think she has all the angels to keep her company, Mija." "But what about people like us? Does she watch over people who are sad?" Daniel had answered without hesitation, his faith then unshakable as bedrock. "Yes, sweetheart. She watches over everyone, especially people who need comfort." Now, sitting in his shed, with Maria's impossible rosary glinting in the darkness, Daniel wondered if his 7-year-old daughter had understood something about mercy that he had forgotten in his grief. That night, for the first time since Elena's funeral, Daniel slept peacefully through until dawn. He woke without the familiar knot of sorrow in his stomach, without the immediate rush of memory that usually began each day with fresh recognition of his losses. Instead, he found himself thinking about the statue waiting in his shed and the impossible rosary that had somehow found its way back to the world of the living. He didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, and wasn't ready to call it a miracle. But for the first time in 3 years, Daniel felt something other than emptiness. When he considered the possibility that death might not be the end of everything he had loved. Daniel woke before dawn, feeling more rested than he had in months. The usual weight of grief that settled on his chest each morning seemed lighter somehow, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Perhaps it was the dreamless sleep, or perhaps it was simply the novelty of facing a mystery instead of another day of empty routine. He dressed quietly and made his way to the shed, drawn by an impulse he couldn't quite name. The statue stood exactly where he had left her, serene and unchanging. In the pale morning light filtering through the window, Maria's rosary lay coiled on the workbench beside her, its silver chain catching the dawn's first rays. But something was different. Draped over the Virgin's shoulders was a shawl Daniel recognized immediately, a soft blue wool wrap that Eleanor had knitted during the long winter months after Maria's death. She had worked on it obsessively, her fingers finding comfort in the repetitive motions of the needles, creating something beautiful from her grief. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the shawl. The wool was dry, despite having spent the night in a shed that leaked when it rained. The stitches were unmistakably Elena's work. She had a distinctive way of finishing edges that no other knitter in the village shared. He had helped her bury this shawl in the trunk at the foot of their bed, wrapped carefully in tissue paper alongside her wedding dress and other treasured items, too painful to look at but too precious to discard. "This isn't happening," Daniel whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He left the shed and hurried to the bedroom he no longer slept in, pulling open the heavy wooden trunk with trembling fingers. Elena's wedding dress lay exactly where he had placed it 2 years ago, still wrapped in protective muslin. Her jewelry box sat unopened, its contents undisturbed. But the blue shawl was gone, leaving only an empty space where it had rested. Daniel sank onto the edge of the bed he had shared with Elena for 38 years. The rational explanations his mind offered sounded increasingly hollow. He hadn't sleepwalked since childhood. No one else had keys to his house. Rosa was the only person who visited regularly, and she would never disturb Elena's things without permission. The sound of footsteps on his front porch interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Through the bedroom window, he could see Rosa approaching, with a covered pot, undoubtedly more soup or stew, despite his repeated protests that he could feed himself perfectly well. "Daniel?" Rosa called through the front door. "I've brought breakfast." He found her in his kitchen, already setting plates on the small table where he and Eleanor had shared countless meals. Rosa had been making herself at home in neighbors' kitchens for decades, a privilege earned through years of caring for anyone in the village who needed tending. "You look pale," she observed, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who had raised 5 children. "Did you sleep at all?" "I slept." "Fine," Daniel replied. "Rosa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She paused in her unpacking of containers, her expression growing serious. "Of course. Did you take anything from Elena's trunk? A blue shawl she knitted?" Rosa's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Why would I do that? I've never even opened that trunk, Daniel. You know I wouldn't touch Elena's personal things without asking." Daniel believed her. Rosa might bustle around his kitchen and reorganize his fishing tackle, but she respected boundaries when it came to grief and memory. "The shawl is gone," he said simply. "It's draped over the statue in my shed." Rosa set down the container of eggs she had been holding. "Show me." They walked to the shed together, Rosa's arthritic pace forcing Daniel to slow his anxious stride. When she saw the statue, now crowned with Eleanor's shawl, Rosa crossed herself and murmured a prayer in Spanish. Too quick for Daniel to follow. Madre de Dios, she breathed. This is Elena's work. I would recognize her knitting anywhere. She approached the statue with reverent steps, her fingers hovering over the soft wool. She was working on this the winter after Maria died. She said it helped quiet her mind. How is this possible, Rosa? The older woman studied the statue for a long moment before answering. I don't know, Daniel. But I know what I'm seeing, and I know you're not the kind of man to play tricks or make up stories for attention. They stood in silence, both contemplating the implications of what lay before them. Finally, Rosa spoke again, her voice thoughtful. My grandmother used to tell stories about saints who appeared to fishermen. She said the sea sometimes gives back what it has taken, but in ways we don't expect. The sea didn't take Maria or Eleanor, Daniel pointed out. No, but grief did, and maybe— Rosa paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe sometimes love finds a way to reach back across that distance. Daniel wanted to dismiss her words as the superstitions of an old woman, but the evidence before his eyes made skepticism difficult to maintain. The rosary, the shawl, these weren't vague signs or wishful thinking. They were concrete, impossible facts that challenged everything he thought he understood about the world. That afternoon, Father Miguel arrived for his monthly visit. The elderly priest's hair had grown whiter in the past year, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints no longer bent easily. But his eyes remained sharp and kind, behind wire-rimmed glasses that had seen decades of village joys and sorrows. You look different, Daniel, Father Miguel observed as they sat in the small living room where Daniel rarely entertained visitors. Less burdened, perhaps. I found something on the beach yesterday, Daniel said, surprised by his own willingness to share. For 3 years he had deflected the priest's gentle attempts at conversation. Today the words came more easily. What did you find? Daniel led Father Miguel to the shed, watching the priest's face carefully as he took in the sight of the statue draped with Elena's shawl. Father Miguel's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something approaching awe. I know. This statue, the priest said slowly. She disappeared from our church about 5 years ago. We assumed someone had stolen her, though we couldn't understand why anyone would take her and leave more valuable items behind. 5 years ago, Daniel repeated. That would have been shortly after Maria's death, during the worst of his grief, when he had stopped attending Mass entirely. Yes, she stood in the side chapel where people came to pray for their departed loved ones. Father Miguel approached the statue with the familiarity of long acquaintance. Many people found comfort in her presence. When she disappeared, several parishioners asked me to order a replacement, but I kept hoping she would somehow find her way back to us. The priest noticed the rosary coiled on the workbench. And this? It belonged to Maria. Daniel's voice was steady now, past the point of questioning what he knew to be true. The same rosary we buried with her. Father Miguel examined the inscription with the same careful attention Rosa had given it, his weathered fingers tracing the tiny letters of Maria's name. When he looked up, his eyes held a depth of understanding that came from 40 years of ministering to people in crisis. There are mysteries in this world that our minds cannot fully grasp, the priest said gently. The Church teaches us that love is stronger than death, but we often think of that as metaphor rather than literal truth. You think this is a miracle? Daniel asked. I think this is love, Father Miguel replied. Whether you call it miraculous or not seems less important than what it means for your heart. As evening approached and Father Miguel prepared to leave, Daniel felt compelled to ask a question that had been forming throughout the day. If I'm not ready to come back to church, does that make me ungrateful for whatever this is? The priest paused at the shed door, considering his words. God doesn't require gratitude as payment for grace, Daniel. Sometimes the most faithful response is simply to remain open to what unfolds. That night, Daniel found himself sitting in the shed long after dark, not quite praying, but not quite ignoring the pull toward something beyond himself. The statue's painted face seemed to hold infinite patience, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for him to understand whatever lesson she had come to teach. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel spoke to his departed wife and daughter, not in the desperate pleading that had characterized his early grief, but in the conversational tone he had used when they were alive. "I don't know what you're trying to tell me," he said to the darkness, "but I'm listening." Father Miguel returned 2 days later, arriving just as Daniel finished his morning walk along the shore. The priest carried a worn leather satchel that Daniel recognized, the same bag that had held communion supplies during house visits when Elena was dying, too weak to attend Mass, but still hungry for the comfort of ritual. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Father Miguel said, settling himself carefully in the kitchen chair Rosa had claimed as her own during her visits. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I wanted to share something with you." Daniel poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, a domestic routine that felt strange after years of solitary mornings. "I'm listening." Father Miguel opened his satchel and withdrew an ancient Bible, its leather binding cracked and softened by decades of handling. Pages marked with countless ribbons and handwritten notes protruded from between the covers like pressed flowers. "This belonged to my predecessor, Father Antonio," the priest began, handling the book with obvious reverence. "He served this parish for 52 years before I arrived. When I first came to San Miguel del Mar, I was young and certain about everything: the nature of faith, the purpose of suffering, the way God moves in the world." Daniel took a seat across from him, genuinely curious despite himself. In 3 years of avoiding Father Miguel's visits, he had never heard the priest speak so personally about his own journey. "I had been here perhaps 6 months when the Herrera family lost their youngest son to fever. Little Carlos was only 4 years old. You remember the family? They lived in the blue house near the harbor." Father Miguel's fingers traced the Bible's worn spine. "The funeral was heartbreaking. The whole village wept for that child, and for his parents who were inconsolable in their grief." Daniel nodded. He remembered the Herreras, though they had moved away years ago when the fishing industry declined. "After the burial, Carlos's mother came to see me," Father Miguel continued. "She was wild with grief, demanding to know why God would take her innocent child while allowing evil people to live long lives. She wanted answers I didn't have, comfort I couldn't provide with the neat theological explanations I had learned in seminary." The priest opened the Bible to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Father Antonio found me that evening, crying in the church like a child myself. I told him I felt like a fraud, that I had no business trying to guide people through sorrows I had never experienced." "What did he tell you?" "He said that the moment I stopped having easy answers was the moment I might actually become useful to God." Father Miguel smiled at the memory. Then he showed me this passage he had marked years earlier. The priest turned the Bible toward Daniel, pointing to a verse highlighted in ink so old it had faded to brown. The words were from the Gospel of John. "Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed." "I don't understand," Daniel admitted. Father Antonio explained it this way: "We spend so much energy trying to understand the complete picture that we miss the invitation to trust in the mystery itself. Faith isn't about having answers, Daniel. It's about remaining open when answers seem impossible." Father Miguel closed the Bible gently. "The statue in your shed, Maria's rosary, Elena's shawl, these things challenge everything I thought I understood about how the spiritual world interacts with our physical reality. But my confusion doesn't make them less real." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the rigid defenses he had built around his heart. "Are you saying you believe this is actually happening? That it's not just grief playing tricks on my mind?" "I'm saying that Rosa witnessed the same impossibilities you did. I'm saying that statue disappeared from our church during the exact time when you needed her most. I'm saying that love has its own logic that doesn't always make sense to our rational minds. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the morning light streaming through Daniel's kitchen window and illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny prayers in the air. Finally, Father Miguel spoke again. "There's something else I want to share with you, something I've never told anyone in the parish." Daniel waited, sensing the weight of whatever confession was coming. 2 years ago, when I was diagnosed with heart problems, I went through my own crisis of faith, not about God's existence, but about my worthiness to serve as a spiritual guide when my own spirit felt so fragile. The priest's voice grew quiet. I prayed for a sign, some indication that my work here mattered, that the years I had devoted to this calling hadn't been wasted. What happened? The next morning, I found a letter on my desk in the church office. It was from a woman I had counseled 15 years earlier, when she was contemplating suicide after her husband left her. She wrote to tell me that something I had said during our conversations had saved her life, though she couldn't remember exactly what it was. She just knew that someone had cared enough to listen. Father Miguel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I had no memory of our conversations being particularly profound. I thought I had failed her, that my words had been inadequate to her pain. But somehow, something had reached through my doubts and uncertainty to touch her heart. Daniel understood the parallel the priest was drawing. "You think that's what's happening with the statue? That Maria and Elena are reaching through somehow?" "I think love doesn't end when breathing stops," Father Miguel replied. "I think the people we love find ways to remind us that the connection between souls runs deeper than physical death." The priest reached into his satchel again and withdrew a small vial of oil, its contents golden in the morning light. "This is chrism oil, blessed by the bishop for sacred purposes. I'd like to anoint the statue, if you're comfortable with that. Not to claim her for the church, but to acknowledge that something holy is happening in your shed." Daniel considered the request. 3 years ago, he would have rejected any religious ritual as meaningless ceremony, but the events of the past few days had cracked open something in his heart that he thought had permanently sealed shut. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think Elena would have liked that." They walked to the shed together, Father Miguel moving slowly but with purpose. The statue seemed to glow in the morning light, Elena's blue shawl draped around her shoulders like a blessing. Maria's rosary caught the sun and threw tiny rainbows on the wooden walls. Father Miguel dipped his thumb in the chrism oil and traced a small cross on the statue's forehead, murmuring a prayer in Latin that Daniel didn't understand but felt in his bones. The scent of the oil, myrrh and balsam, and something indefinably sacred filled the small space. "Thank you," Daniel said when the priest finished. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Father Miguel replied. "For the first time in months, I feel certain that God is still working miracles in our little corner of the world." As the priest prepared to leave, Daniel felt compelled to ask one more question. "What happens now? Do I tell people about this? Do I turn my shed into a shrine?" Father Miguel paused at the garden gate, his expression thoughtful. "I think you simply remain open to whatever comes next. If this is truly a gift from beyond, the next steps will become clear in their own time." That evening, Daniel sat with the statue as had become his new routine, no longer fighting the peace that settled over him in her presence. For the first time in 3 years, he found himself whispering the words of the Hail Mary, the prayer Elena had taught Maria all those years ago. The words felt rusty on his tongue, but they also felt like coming home. The first candle appeared on Daniel's doorstep 3 days after Father Miguel's blessing. It was a simple white votive in a glass holder, the kind sold at the village market for lighting before saints' statues in church. Daniel found it that morning when he stepped outside to collect driftwood for his fireplace, placed carefully beside his front door with no note or explanation. By evening, 2 more candles had joined the first. Rosa arrived as Daniel was lighting his supper lamp, carrying her usual offering of soup and fresh bread. She noticed the candles immediately, her eyes widening with something between concern and recognition. "Word is spreading," she said without preamble, settling herself at his kitchen table with the familiarity of long friendship. "Carmen Delgado mentioned at the market today that she heard something about you finding a religious statue. She asked if it was true that you were keeping it in your shed." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Carmen was a sweet woman, but she possessed the village's most efficient network for sharing information. If Carmen knew, everyone would know by tomorrow. "What did you tell her?" "I told her she should mind her own business," Rosa replied tartly. "But people are curious, Daniel. 3 years you've barely spoken to anyone, and now suddenly there are rumors about miracles and statues appearing from nowhere." More candles appeared over the next 2 days, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in small clusters. Daniel began to recognize the different types: expensive ones from the religious goods store in the next town, homemade candles that smelled of kitchen wax, even a few battery-operated ones that flickered with artificial flame. By the end of the week, Daniel counted 18 candles arranged in a neat semicircle around his front door. Someone had also left a small bouquet of wildflowers and a handwritten note that simply read, "Para la Virgen, gracias." The breakthrough came on a Friday morning, when Daniel found Carmen Delgado waiting on his front porch, her 4-year-old son Miguel clinging to her skirt. Carmen was 32, a single mother who cleaned houses for the wealthier families in neighboring villages. Her son had been born with respiratory problems that required expensive medications the family could barely afford. "Senor Reyes," she began tentatively, "I hope you don't mind me coming to your home." Daniel noticed that little Miguel was breathing heavily despite the cool morning air, his chest rising and falling with the labored rhythm Daniel recognized from his own childhood battles with asthma. "Of course not, Carmen. Is everything all right? I heard, that is, people are saying," she paused, gathering courage, "they say you found a statue of the Virgin Mary, and that she has brought you peace after losing your family." Daniel felt exposed, as if his private grief and tentative healing had become public entertainment. But looking at Carmen's worried face and her struggling child, he found he couldn't turn them away. "Would you like to see her?" he heard himself asking. Carmen's relief was palpable. "Sí, por favor, if it's not too much trouble." Daniel led them to the shed, acutely aware of how humble the space must seem for what people were apparently calling a miracle. The statue stood exactly where he had placed her, Eleanor's shawl still draped around her shoulders, Maria's rosary encoiled nearby. Someone had clearly been caring for her. The wooden surface gleamed with polish, and fresh flowers sat in a small jar beside her base. "Rosa has been helping," Daniel explained, answering Carmen's unspoken question. Carmen approached the statue with reverence, lifting Miguel so he could see the Virgin's painted face. The little boy's breathing seemed to ease slightly in the peaceful atmosphere of the shed. "She's beautiful," Carmen whispered. Would it be all right if we prayed here for a moment?" Daniel nodded, stepping back to give them privacy. He watched Carmen kneel with her son, both of them bowing their heads in silent prayer. Miguel's breathing gradually steadied, and when they finally stood, the child's color looked better than it had when they arrived. "Thank you," Carmen said, tears brightening her eyes. "I don't know if it was the prayer or just the peace of this place, but Miguel hasn't breathed this easily in weeks." As word spread through the village's invisible network of relationships, more visitors began appearing at Daniel's door. They came singly and in small groups, usually in the early morning or late afternoon when the heat was manageable and the workday demands had eased. Old Senora Martinez, no relation to Rosa, arrived, with her arthritic hands wrapped in cloth, seeking relief from pain that kept her awake at night. The Herrera cousins came seeking guidance about a family dispute over their late father's fishing boat. Young mothers brought sick children, elderly men brought worries about their health, teenagers brought prayers for success in school examinations. Daniel found himself in the impossible position of hosting pilgrims to a miracle he still didn't fully understand or accept. He tried to explain that he was just a fisherman, that the statue wasn't his, that he possessed no special powers or insights. But people seemed to find comfort not in anything Daniel said or did, but in the simple act of sitting quietly in the presence of the statue. "It's not about you," Rosa observed one evening as they watched a family of 5 walk down the path from his shed, their faces peaceful in the twilight. "They're not coming to see Daniel Reyes, the miracle worker. They're coming because something holy happened here, and they need to touch that holiness with their own sorrows." Rosa had appointed herself unofficial guardian of the shrine, arriving each morning to sweep the shed, arrange fresh flowers when available, and ensure that visitors treated the space with appropriate respect. She had also taken to bringing extra coffee and simple food for people who traveled from distant villages to pray. "I can't keep this up indefinitely," Daniel protested. "My shed was never meant to be a public place. What if someone gets hurt? What if people expect healings I can't provide?" "Has anyone asked you to heal them?" Rosa countered. "Or are they just asking for a quiet place to bring their troubles to God?" Daniel had to admit that most visitors seemed content simply to spend time in the shed's peaceful atmosphere. Some prayed aloud, some sat in silence, some left small offerings, flowers, candles, handwritten notes of gratitude, but none demanded miracles or claimed dramatic healings. The most profound change was in Daniel himself. 3 weeks after finding the statue, he realized, he was no longer waking each morning with the familiar ache of loss that had defined his days since Maria's death. The grief remained, but it had transformed from a crushing weight into something more like a bittersweet memory of love. He found himself looking forward to Rosa's visits, to Father Miguel's weekly check-ins, even to the gentle conversations with people who came seeking comfort. For the first time since Elena's death, Daniel's house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. One evening, as he sat in the shed after the day's last visitors had departed, Daniel spoke aloud to the statue, as had become his habit. "I still don't understand why you came to me," he said, "but I'm grateful you did." The Virgin Mary's painted expression remained eternally serene, but in the flickering candlelight, Daniel could almost believe she was smiling. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had seen better days. Daniel found it leaning against his front door alongside the now familiar collection of candles and flowers that visitors left daily. His name was written in a child's careful script across the top, but there was no return address. Inside, he discovered a collection of drawings on construction paper, the kind of artwork that covered elementary school bulletin boards throughout the world. The pictures showed angels with oversized wings, Jesus surrounded by hearts and stars, and multiple versions of the Virgin Mary rendered in crayon and colored pencil with varying degrees of artistic skill. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper with the care usually reserved for precious treasures, Daniel found a stack of similar drawings. But these were different. Older, the paper yellowed at the edges, the artistic style more sophisticated despite being clearly the work of a child. His breath caught as he recognized Maria's distinctive way of drawing faces, always with large eyes and gentle smiles. These were pictures she had created in Sunday school during her elementary years, religious scenes that Elena had saved in her Bible, along with pressed flowers and holy cards from special masses. Daniel sank into his kitchen chair, spreading the drawings across the table with trembling hands. Here was Maria's interpretation of the wedding at Cana, complete with water jugs labeled in her careful printing. There was her version of the Annunciation, with the angel Gabriel sporting rainbow wings and the Virgin Mary wearing a crown of stars. But it was the last drawing that brought tears to his eyes. Maria had drawn herself, standing next to a statue of the Virgin Mary, both figures surrounded by a halo of yellow crayon. At the bottom, in the shaky letters of a 7-year-old, she had written, "Me and the Virgin Mary in Papa's shed." "That's impossible," Daniel whispered to his empty kitchen. Maria had never seen the shed used for anything but storing fishing equipment and tools. She had died 3 years before the statue appeared, before Daniel had any reason to think of the humble building as anything resembling a shrine. Yet there it was, in her own handwriting and artistic style, a child's prophetic vision of exactly what his shed had become. Rosa arrived for her daily visit to find Daniel staring at the drawings, his coffee grown cold beside them. "What is it now?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was almost afraid to know. Daniel showed her the drawings, watching her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and wonder. Rosa had known Maria since birth, had attended every school program and birthday. A party. She would recognize the child's artwork as surely as Daniel did. "These are Maria's drawings," Rosa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this one—" She picked up the picture of the shed. "How could she have drawn this?" "I don't know." Daniel felt exhausted by the accumulation of impossibilities. "I found them in my box today, mixed in with drawings from children who visited the shrine. But these are definitely Maria's work from when she was small." Rosa studied the drawing more closely, noting details that hadn't immediately registered. "Look at this, Daniel." She drew candles around the statue and flowers, just like what people bring now. She even drew herself holding a rosary. The implications hung between them like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about time, death, and the persistence of love beyond physical boundaries. That afternoon, Father Miguel arrived for his weekly visit, bringing with him a surprise guest, Dr. Sarah Mendoza, a theologian from the university in the regional capital. Daniel felt immediately defensive, assuming Rosa or someone else had contacted academic authorities about the strange events surrounding the statue. "Dr. Mendoza studies mystical experiences within the Catholic tradition," Father Miguel explained, noting Daniel's wary expression. "I asked her to come not to debunk or investigate, but to help us understand what might be happening here from a theological perspective." Dr. Mendoza was younger than Daniel had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of quiet intensity he associated with serious scholars. She greeted him with genuine warmth and made no move toward the shed without invitation. "I want to be clear about why I'm here," she said as they settled in Daniel's living room. "I'm not here to prove or disprove anything. I study the intersection of faith and inexplicable experiences, trying to understand how people make sense of encounters that challenge conventional understanding." Daniel found himself surprisingly willing to share the events of the past month. The statue's appearance, the impossible rosary and shawl, the growing stream of visitors seeking peace. When he showed Dr. Mendoza Maria's prophetic drawing, her scholarly composure cracked slightly. "In my research, I've encountered similar phenomena," she said carefully. "Cases where deceased loved ones seem to communicate through objects, places, or experiences that provide comfort to the grieving. The Church has documented thousands of such occurrences over the centuries." "Are you saying this is common?" Daniel asked. "Not common, but not unprecedented." "What makes your experience particularly interesting is the communal aspect, the way other people are finding spiritual comfort here. Usually these encounters remain private, meaningful only to the immediate family." Dr. Mendoza spent 2 hours interviewing Daniel, Rosa, and Father Miguel, taking careful notes but asking no invasive questions. When they finally walked to the shed, she approached the statue with the same reverence the village pilgrims showed. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," she observed, examining the Virgin's carved features. "This is definitely 19th century work, probably created by local artisans for a family chapel or small church." She paused, studying Maria's rosary where it lay coiled beside the statue. "May I ask you something, Daniel? When you pray here, and I sense that you do, what do you experience?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Peace," he said finally. "For the first time since losing my family, I feel like I'm not alone in the universe. And the visitors who come here, They seem to find the same thing. Not miracles in the dramatic sense, but he searched for the right words. Permission. To hope again. Dr. Mendoza nodded thoughtfully. In theological terms, what you're describing sounds like what we call consolation, the spiritual comfort that comes from recognizing divine presence in the midst of human suffering. The objects, the impossible appearances, the sense of connection with your departed loved ones, these might be what mystics call sacramental signs, physical manifestations of spiritual truths. So you think this is real? Daniel asked. I think. Your experience of peace and healing is absolutely real, Dr. Mendoza replied. Whether the statue appeared through supernatural intervention or through some natural process we don't understand seems less important than the fruit it's producing, the way it's drawing people back to hope and community. As the afternoon waned, and Dr. Mendoza prepared to leave, she offered one final observation that stayed with Daniel long after her departure. Sometimes, she said, love finds ways to complete its work even after death interrupts the conversation. What's happening? Here feels like a continuation rather than a conclusion. That evening, Daniel sat in the shed surrounded by the accumulated offerings of a month's worth of visitors. Candles and flowers, handwritten prayers, small religious medals and holy cards. For the first time since finding the statue, he felt ready to pray, not just for peace or understanding, but for guidance about what was supposed to happen next. Show me what you want me to do, he whispered to the Virgin's serene face. I'm finally ready to listen. Dr. Hernandez arrived on a cloudy Thursday morning, his medical bag in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. Daniel recognized him immediately, the emergency room physician who had treated Maria after the accident, the kind man who had tried so gently to prepare Daniel and Elena for the worst, while still fighting to save their daughter's life. I hope you don't mind me coming without calling first, Dr. Hernandez said, his voice carrying the same careful compassion Daniel remembered from that terrible night 3 years ago. I heard about the statue you found and, well, there's something I need to share with you. Something I should have told you years ago. Daniel invited him inside, though every instinct warned him that whatever Dr. Hernandez had come to say would change everything once again. They sat in the living room, where Elena used to arrange fresh flowers every Sunday, where Maria had practiced piano lessons and sprawled on the floor doing homework. After Maria's accident, Dr. Hernandez began, opening the manila envelope with careful fingers. We followed standard protocol for traumatic injuries. We documented everything, the extent of her injuries, the timeline of treatment, every medication administered, every procedure attempted. Daniel felt his chest tighten. I know all this. You explained everything to us at the hospital. No, Daniel, I didn't explain everything. Dr. Hernandez withdrew a set of medical records, pages thick with handwriting and official stamps. What I told you was that Maria died from her injuries shortly after arrival. That was true, but it wasn't complete. The doctor's hands shook slightly as he found the specific page he was looking for. Maria actually survived for almost 3 hours after the accident. She was unconscious when the ambulance brought her in, but she regained consciousness twice during treatment. Daniel stared at him, the words not quite making sense. That's impossible. You told us she never woke up. I told you she never regained full consciousness, which was technically accurate, but she did have 2 brief periods of lucidity, maybe 5 minutes total, where she was aware and able to speak. The room seemed to tilt around Daniel. She spoke? What did she say? Dr. Hernandez consulted his notes, though Daniel suspected he had memorized every word long ago. The first time she woke, she asked for water. We gave her ice chips. The second time, about an hour before she passed, she became agitated. She kept asking for her rosary, the silver one with pearl beads that you had given her for First Communion. Daniel's vision blurred. You never told us this. I made a judgment call that I've regretted every day since, Dr. Hernandez admitted, his professional composure cracking. You and Elena were already devastated. I thought giving you hope that she had been conscious, only to lose her anyway, would make your grief unbearable. What else? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. I sent a nurse to get the rosary from Maria's personal effects. When we placed it in her hands, she calmed down immediately. Dr. Hernandez paused, clearly struggling with the next part of his account. Then she said something that made no sense to any of us at the time. Daniel waited, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. She said, "Tell Papa I found the Virgin Mary in the water and she's bringing me home. Tell him she'll come for him too, when he's ready." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He doubled over, gasping for air, as the full impossibility of what he was hearing crashed over him. Those were almost exactly the words he had spoken to the statue in his shed, his private conversations with Maria and Eleanor that no one else could possibly know. "There's more," Dr. Hernandez continued gently. After she said that, she smiled, the first peaceful expression I had seen on her face since the accident. "She asked us to tell you and Elena that she loved you, that she wasn't afraid, and that she would be waiting." Daniel felt tears streaming down his cheeks. 3 years of suppressed grief and guilt finally breaking free. "Why didn't you tell us? We had a right to know she was conscious, that she left messages for us." "I know. I was wrong." Dr. Hernandez set the medical records on the coffee table between them. "I've carried that guilt every day since. When I heard about the statue you found, about how it was bringing you peace, I realized I couldn't keep this secret any longer." "The Virgin Mary in the water," Daniel repeated, his voice hollow with wonder. "She said that 3 years ago." "Yes, and according to Father Miguel, that's exactly how you found the statue, standing in the shallow water like she was waiting for you." Daniel stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the path to his shed. Through the glass, he could see Rosa arranging fresh flowers around the small shrine that had grown up around his front door, her movements patient and reverent. "She knew," he said to the window. "Somehow, Maria knew this would happen." Dr. Hernandez joined him at the window. "I don't pretend to understand how that's possible, but I do know that your daughter's last conscious thoughts were about bringing you comfort. Whatever is happening with that statue, it seems to be fulfilling her final wish." They stood in silence for several minutes, both men grappling with implications that challenged everything they thought they understood about life, death, and the persistence of love beyond physical boundaries. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had been forming in his mind. "Is there anything else? Any other details you haven't told me?" Dr. Hernandez hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. "There is one more thing. When we were preparing Maria's body for the funeral home, we couldn't find her rosary. We searched everywhere. Her clothes, the treatment room, even the ambulance. It had simply disappeared. But we buried her with a rosary," Daniel protested. "I saw it in her hands during the viewing. The funeral director used a different one, similar but not identical. He thought it would be less traumatic than telling you the original had been lost." Dr. Hernandez pulled a small evidence bag from his pocket. "We found this in the treatment room 3 days later, after you had already held the funeral." Through the clear plastic, Daniel could see a single pearl bead, the kind used on rosaries, along with a small piece of silver chain. "It was under one of the medical carts," Dr. Hernandez explained. "We assumed the rosary had been damaged during treatment and the pieces scattered. But now, knowing that you found her rosary with the statue, Daniel took the evidence bag with shaking hands. The pearl bead was identical to the ones on the rosary currently coiled in his shed. The same opalescent sheen, the same size and shape." "I need to sit down," Daniel said, feeling lightheaded. They returned to the living room. Dr. Hernandez's medical training clearly concerned about Daniel's pale complexion and unsteady breathing. But Daniel waved away offers of water or assistance. He needed to process what he had learned, to understand how Maria's dying words 3 years ago had perfectly predicted the statue's appearance and his own spiritual journey. "There's something else I need to tell you, Doctor." Hernandez said, as Daniel stared at the pearl bead. Something personal, not medical. Daniel looked up, surprised by the change in the doctor's tone. My own daughter is about the same age Maria was when she died, Dr. Hernandez continued. Every time I see her, I think about your family, about the words your daughter spoke before she passed. It changed how I practice medicine, how I talk to families facing tragedy. How so? I realize that sometimes the most important healing isn't physical. Sometimes people need to know that love continues even when life ends, that the connections between souls survive the failure of the body. Dr. Hernandez stood to leave, gathering his records. What Maria said that night has helped me comfort dozens of families over the past 3 years. As the doctor reached the front door, he turned back one final time. I don't know if what's happening here is a miracle in the traditional sense, but I do know that your daughter's final gift to you was the promise that love would find a way to reach across death itself. After Dr. Hernandez left, Daniel sat alone in his living room for a long time, holding the evidence bag with Maria's rosary bead and staring at the medical records that reframed everything he thought he knew about his daughter's death. Maria had known. Somehow, impossibly, she had foreseen the statue's appearance, had predicted that it would bring him the comfort he desperately needed. Her dying words weren't just expressions of love, they were prophecy, promise, and invitation, wrapped in the voice of a 28-year-old teacher who loved her father enough to reach back from the edge of death with words of hope. For the first time since finding the statue, Daniel felt ready to acknowledge what his heart had been trying to tell him for weeks. This wasn't coincidence or wishful thinking or the product of a grief-addled mind. This was love keeping its promises, even beyond the grave. That evening, Daniel walked to his shed with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The Virgin Mary stood exactly where he had placed her 6 weeks ago, but everything about her seemed different now. Not mysterious or inexplicable, but familiar, like a letter from home he was finally ready to read. Thank you, he whispered to the statue, to Maria, to Elena, to whatever force in the universe made it possible for love to transcend the boundaries of life and death. Thank you for not giving up on me. The statue's painted eyes seemed to hold infinite patience and infinite compassion, as if she had been waiting all along for him to understand the gift he had been given. Not just peace for his own broken heart, but the opportunity to help others find their way back to hope. Daniel woke before dawn, the morning after Dr. Hernandez's visit, but instead of the usual peaceful emptiness that had characterized his early mornings for weeks, he felt something different, a sense of purpose so clear and compelling it made his hands shake as he dressed. He knew what he had to do. The church bell tower stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, its ancient bronze bell silent since Elena's funeral 2 years ago. Daniel had been the village bell ringer for 15 years before grief drove him away from all things sacred. It was a role that required no theological training, only a willingness to climb the narrow stone steps twice each Sunday and ring the call to worship that had echoed across San Miguel del Mar for over a century. The key to the bell tower hung exactly where Father Miguel had left it 2 years ago, on a nail beside the vestry door. Daniel's fingers remembered the weight of it, the way the old lock required a precise turn to open without sticking. The stairs were narrower than he remembered, or perhaps his 66-year-old body was less flexible than it had been in his 50s. By the time he reached the bell chamber, his breath came in short puffs that clouded in the morning chill. But his hands were steady as he grasped the thick rope that connected to the bell's bronze heart. The first toll rang across the village like a voice calling home after a long absence. Daniel felt the vibration in his bones, the deep resonance that had summoned generations of villagers to prayer, celebration, and mourning. The second toll joined the first, then the third, each note carrying across the harbor and up the hillsides, where people were beginning their daily routines. By the sixth toll, Daniel could see lights appearing in windows throughout the village. People stepping onto their porches to listen to the bell they hadn't heard in 2 years. Rosa emerged from her house in her nightgown and robe, looking up toward the tower with her hand pressed to her heart. Daniel rang the bell slowly, deliberately, letting each note fade before beginning the next. This wasn't the quick, celebratory pealing of wedding bells or the frantic alarm of emergency. This was the measured call of invitation, the voice of community reaching out to gather its scattered children. When he finally descended the tower steps, Father Miguel was waiting in the vestry, his white hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes bright with understanding. "I heard the bell from the rectory," the priest said simply. "Are you ready to come home, Daniel?" "I think I am," Daniel replied, "but I need to do this my own way." They walked back to Daniel's house together as the village began to stir with curiosity and anticipation. The bell had served its purpose. By the time they reached Daniel's front gate, Rosa was already bustling around his kitchen, preparing coffee and arranging the simple furniture to accommodate guests. "People will come," she announced without preamble. "When the bell rings after 2 years of silence, people notice. They'll want to know what's happened." She was right. By mid-morning, Daniel's small living room was filled with neighbors who hadn't crossed his threshold since Elena's funeral. Carmen sat in the corner with little Miguel, whose breathing had improved dramatically since their first visit to the shrine. Old Joaquin occupied the chair by the window, his weathered hands folded in his lap with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for fish and storms with equal composure. The younger families came too, parents Daniel barely knew, drawn by curiosity about the bell and stories they had heard about the statue in his shed. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at being in the house where miracles supposedly happened. "I rang the bell this morning because I have something to share with all of you," Daniel began, his voice carrying more strength than he had felt in years. Something about faith and loss, and the way love finds ways to reach us, even when we think we're beyond its reach. He told them about finding the statue, about Maria's impossible rosary, and Elena's vanished shawl. He shared Dr. Hernandez's revelation about Maria's final words, and the way those words had predicted exactly what would unfold in his shed over the past 6 weeks. The room remained completely silent as Daniel spoke, even the children sensing the gravity of what they were hearing. When he finished, Carmen was the first to respond. "My Miguel hasn't needed his inhaler once since we started visiting the statue," she said quietly. "The doctor says his lungs are clearer than they've been since he was born. My arthritis doesn't hurt as much when I arrange the flowers in your shed," Rosa added. "I thought it was just staying busy, but now I think it might be something more." One by one, others began sharing their own experiences. The sense of peace they found in the shrine, the way their worries seemed less overwhelming after spending time in prayer there. Small improvements in health, relationships, and outlook that might have been dismissed as coincidence, if not for the accumulation of similar stories. "What happens now?" asked young Carlos Vega, a fisherman who had recently started bringing his boat alongside Daniel's during the early morning runs. "Do we turn your shed into a tourist attraction? Do we call the bishop to investigate?" Daniel had been pondering the same questions since Dr. Hernandez's visit. "I've been thinking about that. This statue came to me when I needed her most. But she's brought healing to all of you as well. Maybe she belongs not to me, but to our community." Father Miguel leaned forward in his chair. "What are you proposing, Daniel?" "I want to keep the shrine here in my shed, where she can continue to offer comfort to anyone who needs it. But I also want to formalize our community's commitment to caring for this place and for each other." Daniel paused, gathering his thoughts. "Rosa has been helping me tend the shrine, but I think we need more than that. I think we need to become the kind of community where people don't suffer alone, where grief doesn't isolate us from the love that surrounds us." The idea that had been forming in his mind since dawn became clearer as he spoke. "I want to establish regular times for prayer and reflection at the shrine. I want to create a way for people to share their burdens and their joys. I want to make sure that anyone who comes seeking peace finds not just a statue, but a community willing to walk alongside them. Old Joaquin spoke for the first time since arriving. You're talking about bringing the church to your backyard. No, Daniel corrected gently. I'm talking about remembering that the church was always supposed to be wherever people gather to comfort each other and seek God together. Father Miguel nodded approvingly. The early Christians met in homes, in simple places where they could share bread and prayer. There's nothing unorthodox about what you're proposing. The conversation continued for another hour, with practical details emerging organically from the group's collective wisdom. Rosa volunteered to coordinate a schedule of caretakers for the shrine. Carmen offered to help with cleaning and maintenance. Carlos suggested building simple benches to accommodate larger groups during prayer times. Most importantly, they agreed on something Daniel hadn't expected, that the shrine would remain open to everyone, regardless of their relationship with the formal church. The statue had appeared to a man who had walked away from his faith, and she had welcomed back not just him, but anyone who came seeking peace. As the gathering began to disperse, Daniel felt a profound shift in the atmosphere of his home. For 2 years, these rooms had felt like a mausoleum, heavy with memories and empty of life. Today, they felt like what they had always been, a place where family gathered, where community was nurtured, where love was shared. That afternoon, Daniel walked to his shed, no longer his private retreat, but the community's shared sanctuary. The statue stood exactly where he had placed her weeks ago, but everything else had changed. Fresh flowers filled every available jar and vase. Candles flickered on improvised stands made from wooden crates. Handwritten prayers and notes of gratitude covered a small bulletin board Rosa had installed on one wall. But the most significant change was in Daniel himself. The bitter, isolated man who had pulled the statue from the water 6 weeks ago had been transformed into someone ready to serve, to welcome, to offer his own healed heart as proof that love could triumph over loss. "Thank you," he whispered to the Virgin Mary, to Maria, to Elena, to the mysterious workings of grace that had brought them all to this moment. "I understand now what you were trying to teach me." The statue's painted eyes seemed to hold infinite compassion and infinite patience, as if she had known all along that love, given enough time, could heal any wound and restore any broken community to wholeness. Tomorrow, Daniel would begin the work of formal ministry, not as a priest or professional religious, but as a witness to the power of love to reach across death itself. Tonight, he would simply rest in the peace that had become his new foundation, grateful beyond words for the second chance he had never dared to hope for. The first formal gathering at Daniel's shrine took place on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the bell had called the community home. Word had spread beyond San Miguel del Mar, through the invisible networks that connect small coastal villages. Family, visits, market conversations, and the simple human need to share stories of hope with anyone willing to listen. Daniel stood at his kitchen window, watching people arrive along the path that led from the village center to his house. Some he recognized: Rosa with her arms full of fresh flowers, Father Miguel carrying a small wooden cross, Carmen walking hand in hand with Miguel, whose breathing remained clear and strong. Others were strangers, families from neighboring villages, who had heard whispers of a statue that brought peace to the grieving. The shed that had once held only fishing nets and tools now hosted nearly 40 people, with additional chairs arranged in the small garden Rosa had helped him plant. The statue stood in her place of honor, Elena's blue shawl draped around her shoulders, Maria's rosary coiled nearby, like a silver promise that love endures beyond death. Daniel had spent days worrying about what to say, how to lead a gathering of people seeking spiritual comfort when his own faith remained tender and newly recovered. But as the group settled into expectant silence, the words came naturally. 6 weeks ago, I was a man who had given up on God, Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I had decided that the universe was indifferent to human suffering, that prayer was just talking to empty sky, that death was the final word on everything we love. He paused, looking around at the faces gathered before him, young mothers with sleeping babies, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers who had come with their parents and stayed out of genuine curiosity rather than obligation. But then this statue appeared in the water, carrying with her reminders of my daughter and wife who had died. Not just similar objects, but the exact same rosary and shawl I had buried with them, or hidden away in grief. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Even people who had heard the story before seemed moved by Daniel's simple recounting of events that challenged every rational explanation. "I don't pretend to understand how that's possible," Daniel continued. "But I do understand what it means. It means that love is stronger than death. It means that the people we've lost aren't truly gone, just transformed into something our eyes can't see, but our hearts can still feel." Carmen raised her hand tentatively. "Would it be all right if I shared something?" Daniel nodded, grateful. For the community's willingness to participate rather than simply listen, Carmen stood, lifting Miguel, so everyone could see his healthy color and easy breathing. 3 months ago, my son was in the hospital twice with asthma attacks, so severe the doctors talked about permanent medication. Since we started coming here to pray, he hasn't needed his inhaler once. The pediatrician says his lungs are completely clear. An elderly man Daniel didn't recognize spoke up from the back of the group. "I'm Eduardo Morales from Santa Catalina. My wife died last year after 52 years of marriage. I stopped eating, stopped caring for myself, stopped believing life was worth living. My daughter brought me here 2 weeks ago." Eduardo's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I can't say I'm completely healed from my grief, but for the first time since Maria Elena died, I woke up this morning looking forward to something. Coming here, being part of this community of people who understand loss but haven't given up on hope." The sharing continued organically without prompting from Daniel. A young mother spoke about finding strength to leave an abusive marriage after praying in the shrine. A teenager talked about discovering purpose in caring for his elderly grandmother. An unemployed fisherman described the peace he found that enabled him to face each day's uncertainty with dignity rather than despair. What struck Daniel most powerfully was how ordinary the miracles were. No one claimed dramatic physical healings or supernatural visions. Instead, they testified to quieter gifts, the return of hope, the ability to forgive, the strength to continue loving despite loss, the grace to find meaning in suffering. Rosa stood near the end of the sharing time, her weathered hands clasped in front of her like a child preparing to recite a lesson. "I want to say something about Daniel, if that's all right." Daniel felt his cheeks warm, uncomfortable with being the focus of attention. 3 months ago, this man was dying of grief, Rosa said bluntly. Oh, he was still breathing, still going through the motions of living, but his heart was dead. I brought him food twice a week and watched him waste away, and I didn't know how to help him. She paused, looking directly at Daniel with the fierce affection of someone who had known him for 30 years. Now look at him. He's not the same man. The statue didn't just bring him peace, it brought him back to life. And through his healing, she's brought healing to all of us. The gathering concluded with a simple prayer that Father Miguel offered, asking for continued blessing on the shrine and on all who sought comfort there. But the real benediction came from the community itself, the way people lingered to help stack chairs, the conversations that continued in small groups, the natural planning for next week's gathering that emerged without any formal organization. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Daniel found himself in conversation with Eduardo, the widower from Santa Catalina, whose honest sharing had moved the entire group. "How do you do it?" Eduardo asked. "How do you maintain a place like this without it becoming a circus or a tourist attraction?" Daniel considered the question, thinking about the delicate balance between welcoming seekers and protecting the sacred atmosphere that made the shrine effective. I think it stays authentic because we don't claim more than what's actually happening, Daniel replied. We don't promise miracles or charge admission or turn suffering into entertainment. We just offer a quiet place where people can bring their sorrows to God and find community with others who understand. Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. Would you be willing to help me establish something similar in my village? Not a copy of this, but a place where grieving people can find support. The question surprised Daniel, but he realized it shouldn't have. If love could reach across death to bring him a statue and a rosary, why couldn't it spread horizontally? Through networks of human connection and shared compassion, I'd be honored to help, Daniel said. But I think the real secret isn't the statue or the location. It's the willingness of people like you to admit they need healing and to offer their own healing to others. As the afternoon light began to slant through the shed's windows, Daniel stood alone with the statue for the first time in hours. The space still held the warmth of community gathering, the lingering energy of shared prayer and mutual support. This is what you wanted, isn't it? He asked the Virgin Mary's serene face. Not just my healing, but a place where healing could spread from person to person, family to family, village to village. The statue offered no audible answer, but Daniel felt a deep certainty that his understanding was correct. The miracle wasn't just the statue's impossible appearance or the return of Maria's rosary. The miracle was the transformation of his grief-isolated shed into a center of community healing, a place where people discovered they didn't have to suffer alone. That evening, as Daniel prepared for sleep in the bedroom he had avoided for 2 years, he felt a profound gratitude, not just for his own healing, but for the privilege of witnessing love's ability to multiply itself through human community. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new sorrows, new opportunities to offer the comfort he had received. For the first time since Maria's death, Daniel looked forward to tomorrow not as another day to endure, but as another chance to participate in the endless circulation of grace that connects all human hearts in their deepest needs and highest hopes. 2 months after that first community gathering, Father Miguel arrived at Daniel's house carrying a small vial of golden oil and an announcement that would change everything. The bishop wants to visit, Father Miguel said without preamble, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his regular spot during their weekly conversations. Bishop Ramirez has heard about what's happening here, and he wants to see for himself. Daniel felt his stomach clench. Is that good or bad? It's careful, Father Miguel replied diplomatically. The Church has protocols for investigating claims of miraculous occurrences. Bishop Ramirez is a thoughtful man, not given to dramatic gestures in either direction, but he needs to ensure that what's happening here is authentic and beneficial. The bishop's visit was scheduled for the following Sunday, which gave Daniel exactly 1 week to worry about everything that could go wrong. What if the bishop found the shrine lacking in proper religious protocol? What if he decided the community gatherings were inappropriate without official church supervision? What if he ordered the statue returned to the formal church building, where it would be just another religious artifact instead of a living center of healing? Rosa arrived early that Sunday morning, fussing over flower arrangements and candle placements with the nervous energy of someone preparing for the most important dinner party of her life. Everything needs to be perfect, she muttered, repositioning. A vase of white roses for the 3rd time. Rosa, Daniel said gently, it's not a performance. If Bishop Ramirez doesn't understand what's happening here by experiencing it naturally, then no amount of perfect flower arrangements will convince him. But even Daniel felt the weight of expectation as people began arriving for what had become the weekly Sunday gathering. The usual crowd was joined by curious parishioners from the formal church, people who had heard about the bishop's visit and wanted to witness whatever was about to unfold. Bishop Ramirez arrived precisely on time, a tall man in his 60s, whose grey beard and kind eyes immediately put Daniel at ease. He wore simple black clothing rather than elaborate vestments, and he greeted each person in the gathering with genuine warmth before taking a seat in the back row. Daniel had prepared remarks for the bishop's benefit, but as the community settled into their familiar rhythm of sharing and prayer, he realized that the best thing he could do was let the authentic spirit of their gatherings speak for itself. Carmen spoke about Miguel's continued good health and the way their family had found strength through community support. Eduardo, who had traveled from Santa Catalina with several members of the support group he had started there, testified to the ripple effects of healing that spread from village to village. A new voice, Maria Santos, a young widow with twin daughters, shared how the shrine had given her courage to rebuild her life after her husband's death in a fishing accident. Throughout the sharing, Bishop Ramirez listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating spiritual claims. But Daniel noticed that the bishop's expression gradually softened from professional assessment to genuine engagement with the stories he was hearing. When the sharing time concluded, Father Miguel stood and addressed the gathering. Bishop Ramirez has asked to speak with us about what he's observed here today. The bishop rose slowly, his presence commanding respectful silence without any dramatic gestures. I came here this morning expecting to evaluate whether this shrine meets the church's standards for authentic religious experience, he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in ministry. What I found instead was something that reminded me why those standards exist in the first place, to ensure that people encountering the sacred are drawn closer to love, hope, and community rather than further from them. He paused, looking around at the faces gathered in Daniel's small shed. I have visited many places where people claim miraculous experiences. Too often, I find spiritual tourism rather than spiritual transformation, spectacle rather than sanctification. Daniel held his breath, waiting for the judgment that would determine the shrine's future. But here, Bishop Ramirez continued, I see fruit that can only grow from genuine encounters with divine grace. I see people who are isolated in their suffering finding community. I see grief transformed into service. I see faith restored not through dramatic signs, but through the quiet recognition that love persists beyond death. The bishop walked to where the statue stood, draped in Elena's blue shawl with Maria's rosary nearby. This statue belongs to the church, in the formal sense. It was carved for our parish and blessed for liturgical use. But I believe it has found its proper home here, in this place where it can continue the work of healing it was always meant to do. He withdrew the small vial of oil from his pocket. I would like to formally bless this shrine and acknowledge it as a legitimate place of pilgrimage and prayer within our diocese. The blessing ceremony was simple but profound. Bishop Ramirez anointed the statue with chrism oil while praying in Latin, then offered a blessing in Spanish that encompassed not just the physical space, but the community that had formed around it. I commission this shrine as a place of consolation for the grieving, hope for the despairing, and community for the isolated, he concluded. May all who come here find what Daniel found, that love is indeed stronger than death. As the bishop prepared to leave, he took Daniel aside for a private word. The church has a formal process for recognizing lay ministers who serve communities like this one. If you're interested, I would like to discuss ways we can support your ministry while preserving its authentic character. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. I never imagined this would become a ministry. I was just a grieving man who found a statue. The best ministries often begin exactly that way, Bishop Ramirez replied. God rarely calls the prepared, he prepares the called. That evening, after all the visitors had departed and the excitement of official recognition had settled into quiet gratitude, Daniel sat alone in his blessed shrine. The statue seemed to glow in the candlelight, her painted expression holding the same infinite compassion that had drawn him from the beginning. "We did it," he whispered to Maria and Elena, to the Virgin Mary, to whatever force in the universe had orchestrated this unlikely transformation. "We turned grief into healing, isolation into community, despair into hope." For the first time since finding the statue, Daniel felt that his journey was complete, not ended, but fulfilled in the way a promise is fulfilled when it becomes reality. 6 months later, Daniel stood on his familiar rocky shore in the pre-dawn darkness, but he was no longer alone. Beside him, 22-year-old Carlos Mendez adjusted the nets in their shared fishing boat with the careful attention of someone still learning the ancient rhythms of sea and tide. "The water's perfect this morning," Carlos observed, his young voice carrying the enthusiasm Daniel remembered from his own early days as a fisherman. "Should be a good catch," Daniel smiled, remembering when he had once needed solitude to face each day. Now he found strength in companionship, purpose in passing along the knowledge Elena and Maria would never have the chance to receive from him directly. Carlos was the nephew of Carmen Delgado, sent by his family from the capital city after struggling with depression and a sense of purposelessness that had worried everyone who loved him. He had arrived at the shrine 3 months ago, hollow-eyed and skeptical, looking for any reason to hope that life might hold meaning for someone who felt like he didn't belong anywhere. "My aunt says I should talk to the man with the magic statue," Carlos had announced on his first visit, his tone challenging despite the desperation Daniel recognized in his eyes. "She thinks you can fix broken people." "I can't fix anyone," Daniel had replied honestly, "but I know something about being broken. And I know something about how love finds ways to put us back together." The partnership that emerged between them surprised everyone, including Daniel. Carlos brought youthful energy and modern ideas about sustainable fishing practices. Daniel offered decades of experience reading weather patterns and understanding the sea's moods. Together, they found a rhythm that honored both tradition and innovation. The shrine had evolved as well, growing from Daniel's private retreat into something that served the broader community while maintaining its essential character as a place of authentic healing. Rosa had organized a rotating schedule of caretakers who ensured fresh flowers and clean space without turning the humble shed into a tourist attraction. Father Miguel offered monthly masses in the garden for those who wanted formal liturgy alongside the weekly community gatherings. Most significantly, the model had spread to other villages throughout the coastal region. Eduardo's group in Santa Catalina had grown into a network of support that served 3 neighboring communities. A young widow in Puerto Azul had started gathering other military families dealing with loss. Even in the regional capital, a hospital chaplain had begun hosting weekly grief support meetings inspired by the authentic healing she had witnessed at Daniel's shrine. The bishop was right, Father Miguel had observed during his most recent visit. Sometimes the church grows not through grand campaigns, but through people discovering that love really is stronger than death, then sharing that discovery with their neighbors. The official recognition had brought some changes Daniel was still adjusting to. A small bronze plaque near the shrine entrance identified it as Our Lady of the Harbor, Shrine of Consolation for the Grieving. Visitors occasionally arrived from distant places, drawn by word-of-mouth accounts of healing and peace. A local artist had donated a beautiful wooden bench carved with images of fishing nets and waves, providing seating that honored the shrine's origins while accommodating larger gatherings. But the essential spirit remained unchanged. The statue stood in her place of honor, Elena's blue shawl still draped around her shoulders, Maria's rosary still coiled nearby as a silver reminder that love transcends the boundaries of life and death. Visitors still came seeking not spectacle but comfort, not entertainment but authentic encounter with the sacred in its most gentle and approachable form. As their fishing boat cut through the morning swells, Carlos asked a question that had become a part of their regular conversation. Do you ever wonder why the statue came to you specifically? Why not to Father Miguel, or Rosa, or someone who never lost their faith? Daniel had pondered this mystery countless times over the past months. I think maybe it's because I needed the most dramatic intervention, he said finally. My faith was so completely broken that only something impossible could crack it open again. And now, Daniel considered his answer as he watched the sun begin to paint the horizon with soft gold light. Now, I think the statue did what she came to do. She reminded me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that love finds ways to continue its work even after death interrupts the conversation. They fished in comfortable silence for several hours, their nets gradually filling with the day's catch. As they prepared to return to harbor, Daniel noticed a familiar figure walking the shoreline, a middle-aged woman he didn't recognize, moving slowly along the rocks with the careful attention of someone searching for something specific. Look, Carlos said, pointing toward the woman. Think she's looking for what you found? Daniel watched the woman pause at almost the exact spot where he had discovered the statue 7 months ago. She stood motionless for several minutes, staring out at the water with an expression he recognized, the hollow gaze of someone whose grief had worn them thin as paper. Let's bring the boat in, Daniel said. I think we might have a visitor to welcome home. As they secured their nets and prepared to dock, Daniel felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had become his new foundation. The statue had taught him that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, not a private experience, but a communal gift that multiplied when shared. The woman on the shore represented another opportunity to offer what he had received, not answers to life's impossible questions, but companionship on the journey toward hope. Whether she found a statue or simply found a community willing to walk alongside her through grief, she would not have to carry her sorrow alone. That evening, as Daniel prepared for sleep in the bedroom he had reclaimed from memory, he offered his nightly prayer of gratitude, not just for his own healing, but for the privilege of witnessing love's endless creativity in finding ways to restore broken hearts to wholeness. Through his window, he could see candlelight flickering in the shrine where someone, perhaps the woman from the shore, had come seeking comfort. The sight filled him with deep satisfaction. The statue had come to him when he needed her most, but she had never belonged to him alone. She belonged to everyone who needed to be reminded that love is indeed stronger than death, that grief can be transformed into compassion, and that no one has to face life's deepest sorrows without the support of a community that understands. In the gentle dance of candlelight visible through his window, Daniel saw the future. Not an ending, but an eternal beginning where love continues. Its work of healing through human hearts, willing to remain open to grace, one broken soul at a time. The fisherman who had once pulled a statue from the sea now understood that he had been pulled from something far deeper, the isolation that makes grief unbearable. In learning to receive comfort, he had discovered his true calling, helping others find their way home to hope, one prayer, one conversation, one act of compassion at a time. Outside his window, the shrine glowed with quiet welcome, ready for tomorrow's pilgrims, tomorrow's sorrows, tomorrow's opportunities for love to prove once again that it is the strongest force in any universe worth inhabiting.